Greetings and welcome everyone to our week 2 of our Race Matters class. Hello again, I'm Dr. Carol and we have Dr. Newton here and we are your co-facilitators for this course. And just a reminder of our format, we will start with our guest professor speaking for just about 10 minutes and then asking some questions and inviting questions from all of you. You can put your questions in the Q&A function. And just to respect your time, we will definitely end at 7. So we may not get to all of the questions, but we will do our very best. Our video of this recorded lecture in discussion will be available on our class YouTube channel tomorrow. And so we can also just continue the conversation there, but we are just excited to get back with you. We had such a great time last week and we're looking for a great time today. And so we will begin with just introductions of our guest instructor and our community guests. Thank you.
So you know his voice, right? Now you get to see his face. Dr. Scott Schaefer, who was our guest professor for this week. There he is. He is an associate professor of biology here at Laboratories University. He joined the faculty in 2016 after a postdoctoral position in horticulture at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His teaching and research interests include plants and molecular biology. And he grew up on a small farm, which is where his love of all things plants and genes kind of came from. And I'm told if there's a lag in the conversation this evening that he will entertain us with his favorite parlor trick, which is if you give him a birthday, he can tell you the day of the week on which you were born. I'm sorely tempted to give him mine right now, but in the name of time, Dr. Carol is going to introduce our next guest for the evening.
Yes, thank you. And our next guest is Dr. Esch. And Dr. Esch is an adjunct professor of biology at Laboratories University, where he teaches immunology and maintains a private laboratory in Lenoir, North Carolina. He served as Chief Science Officer of Greer Laboratories, a healthcare company specializing in the diagnosis and treatment of allergies through allergy immunotherapy. He earned his PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his BS and MS degrees in bacteriology and public health from Washington State University. Welcome, Dr. Esch.
Thanks for inviting me.
Sure.
Dr. Esch, any chance you could turn your video on so that we can see your lovely face too? Excellent. So Dr. Schaefer, you're going to get us started today with a little mini lecture.
All right. Thank you, Taylor. And thank you, Summer, for having me. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the hard science. This is a fascinating, this whole course is fascinating. And I really enjoyed Veronica's talk last week. And I hope everyone is enjoying all the talks. And there's a lot of great talks still to come. So be sure you all take the opportunity to listen to all the talks. I'm going to hopefully not bore you too much. I'm going to give you just a tiny little lecture, and I promise there's no exam or quizzes at the end of it. So that's the one catch. And if you give me your birthday, I just want to point out, if you give me your birthday, then I know your age. That's the one bad thing about that. So some of you may not want to do that. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a quick look at just a few little basic review of some basic biology. So we're looking at the nature of race and ancestry. And when we're teaching a genetics course, or any biology course for that matter, we like to point out that one of the criteria for life is the transfer of information from one generation to the next. And I like to say molecular information. And I start focusing on things like, okay, what is molecular information? Well, it's molecules. And most of you can say that must be your genes, and you're correct if that's if that was your answer. So to just tie it in a little bit, humans have chromosomes in their cells, and this is the molecular information that we're going to pass on to progeny. And every chromosome is composed of nucleic acid and proteins. That nucleic acid we talk about as your DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And I've got a little picture over here. I don't know if you can see my little DNA molecule here if my cursor is moving around, but when you look at that, you have little sequences within the molecule. These are called nucleotides. And you probably heard of these before, the A's and T's and the C's and the G's. And of course, if they're in certain sequences, they code for certain proteins, the gene portion. Not all of your DNA is genes. As a matter of fact, we have about 22,000 genes in the human genome. You hear the term genome as you've been listening to some of the talks and the videos. The genome is basically all of your chromosomes and all of those genes collectively that we look at. And of course, we can look at the genome and we can look for differences in some of those DNA sequences. And that's sort of one way that we can sort of determine who's related and how we classify different organisms. Biologists really like to classify things, and they look for certain criteria. And one of those that we use now is looking at molecular information or DNA and sequencing it. And of course, we've sequenced the human genome. And the first time we sequenced the human genome, it took 13 years and cost, I believe, $3 billion. Now you can sequence your entire genome for under $5,000 and do it in less than a month. So it's giving us a lot of new information. So you may have said, well, in the past you said so-and-so was related this way or this way. Well, now we have more information, and that's how science works. We build on that. So we have these genes, and these genes are passed on from our parents. And each parent gives you half of your chromosomes. So in theory, half of your genes, if we're dealing with your nuclear genes. Now, these genes, as I said, code for proteins, and the genes are going to, there's certain genes are always expressed, but other genes, the environment determines whether they're going to be expressed, and the environment may also select which genes are going to be favored in a population. Now, when I say favored, it means make the proteins, make the physical characteristics, which we call the phenotype, which is and there are many phenotypes out there. And the ones we think of are things like blue eyes or brown hair, but it could be tall, it could be short, it could be skin pigmentation, right? There's different degrees of skin pigmentation. It could also be related to many other, metabolism, metabolic conditions. But that's our phenotype, and we say that's the character, which is the height or the eye color or hair color. And there are different types of characters, and that's what we call the traits. And those traits are really variations within that DNA sequence. All right, so now you've had a little bit, and there, if you look at the DNA, you can see it's wound up, and it's, we wrap it around the proteins, the histone proteins, and of course, we fold these over and over again until we get to what looks like what you would think of as your standard chromosome. By the way, your chromosomes do not always look like these giant X's. That is only for a short period of time. Most of the time they're unwound, so those genes can be exposed to biomolecules, and we can actually make our phenotypes. That is a really quick lecture, all right? Normally we'd spend, 2 or 3 weeks on this. So I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version. So let's move on with just another quick little lecture piece, and that is, so I was talking about genes. They can have different sequences, and we call this variation or variances. And I know if you were watching the talk on the biology of our skin color, they started talking about, oh, there's not a lot of variation for the gene for pigmentation in Africa, but then once we move into Europe, we see a little bit more variation. But other genes, all of a sudden, we don't see as much variation. So there's selection pressures going on in the environment, but we all have all of these genes. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. Some of us express more of these and some of us see different variation. And I thought what I'd do just quickly here, and you're looking at my little table here, and I've decided we take 2 parents that each have different forms of 2 separate genes, but they each contribute to a characteristic. It could be pigmentation. This is my old apple breeding one, and we were like, apples also, you may not be aware of this, they have different skin colors. Some apples have very dark red, others have light, some have those yellow one, that yellow golden delicious apple. So if we look here, what I've done, I just, rolled across my mouse there. So if we look here, you'll notice I have 1s and 2s. So I've got this gene that's going to contribute to apple pigmentation color. And I've got actually 2 genes that contribute to apple pigmentation color. So there's a slight variance within each one, but then I have 1s and 2s, which mean the 1s add pigment, the 2s do not give as much. And so if you look at my first box, you're going to say, how many of these 1s do I have? I've got AA, meaning for each parent gave us that chromosome and they each have a 1. So they're each giving the pigment. And then you look at another pair of chromosomes. And again, you see BB is 1, 1. So they're both contributing. So we have 4 copies of the gene giving us pigment. Gives us a very dark red apple. Now, if you go to the next box, let's just go across the top row there to the second box. You should see 3 1s, right? If you count those, you can see 3 1s. So we're not giving quite as much pigmentation at this point. We're only going to give 3 copies. It's a little bit lighter. If you notice, we have this apple's going to be a little lighter red. The next one across, again, we have 3 copies that are going to give pigmentation. Now let's go to the final box on the top row. We have 2 copies now of the pigmentation, right? The other 2 are not giving, the 2 is not contributing. Each gene, this is a very simple model. We're saying each gene's giving an equal amount. Don't get me started in all the differences and pathways and rules I'm breaking right now here. But remember, they're each, let's simply think of each one as contributing, you know, one dose of that protein or pigment. So now we have 2 copies. It's a little bit lighter. And as you look through each box, you can count the 1s and 2s. And the more 1s you have, the more copies of the pigment we're getting. Let's go to the, I'm going to speed up a little bit. Let's go to the bottom. Let's go to the bottom right-hand corner there. Do you see any of those genes that have a 1 with them? No, not a 1. We're not giving any copies of that pigmentation, right? This is our yellow apple at this point. This is one of the neat things when we're dealing with certain genes. A lot of people think, oh, I have the gene, I have the trait. You know, and that was sort of Mendel. These were qualitative, discrete traits where it was one gene, one character. In reality, most biology doesn't work that way. There are many genes that contribute, and we call this polygenic inheritance, or we call this continuous inheritance, and each is giving a little bit. Height is a perfect example of that. There's so many genes that each give you a little bit to height, 150 genes. I bring this up because when we look at skin pigmentation, the genes that are contributing the pigment, you know, the melanin here, there's 34 genes that have been identified. So imagine making a table like this with 34 of these genes, each with our 1s and our 0s here. Imagine the wide range of possibilities that are combined for the entire population. We have an incredible amount of diversity that we see. And so if I pull down one more slide here, and I'll have a question you can ponder for later in our discussion. So look at this family here. Again, we're dealing with 34 genes. If you look at these 2 young females on the right, would you say that they belong to the same race, if we're going to use that race connotation here? These are twin sisters here, right? And again, which of those A's with the 1 or the 2, it's completely random. Each parent gives you half of your DNA, right? And it's completely by chance. You could have a sibling that you share all of the genes because you share all of the chromosomes. You could also have a sibling where you don't have anything in common with them. You may not share a single one of those chromosomes. So we have an incredible amount of variability in the population. So I know I'm almost out of time here. I don't want to take the entire period, but you know, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, first of all, that you know, geographic isolation may cause a little bit of genetic differences, but the genes are all there. It's the ones that are selected for. So they're all there. And we have most of them are you know, they're very common. We are genetically 99.9% genetically identical to everyone else on the planet. That 0.1% is the only difference. And this difference that does exist because of occasional geographic isolation is continuous. It's not discrete. It's not you get one gene, you're this type of person here. It is a continuum, just like weight or height. So race does not predict major genetic differences or similarities any more than height. Race makes absolutely no sense when it comes to biological classification. I'm going to stop there and let Bob introduce himself also.
Oh, okay. I found the mute button. one thing I sort of wanted to add to this variability, maybe it's going to confuse us more, but it's this concept of genetic determinism, meaning that you described how these genes are highly variable, traits are polygenic, but genes can also be incredibly polymorphic, meaning that there's a lot more than just two variants or forms of a gene. And then more recently, the expression of the genes can be controlled by environment, diet, microbiome, and so on. So even twins that are raised apart can become very different in terms of their expression of their genes. So the genes alone probably account, I'm sort of going from immunology and risk of developing allergic disease and asthma, only account for 50% of risk for developing these medical conditions. The other 50% is the environmental or epigenetic influences on those genes. I wanted to ask Scott if, I mean, my genetics is limited to, the field of allergy and immunology, but is this a common, how phenotypes can be controlled by these other factors other than genes themselves?
Yes. All right. No, I'm going to go. Yeah. Yes. Environment is a major player. And as a matter of fact, when I talk about phenotype, we like to say phenotype is a combination of genotype and environment. And environment is especially important when we're dealing with polygenic inheritance, a lot of genes. And I think when we talk about a single gene, then maybe environment doesn't play as big a factor. Huntington's disease is one gene for the disease, and there's nothing you can really do environmentally to prevent that gene from being expressed. But when we talk about, polygenic inheritance, which is really what we're looking at, multiple genes, environment plays a huge part. As a matter of fact, there's a peach tree, and you always think of a peach as, right, it's got the peach shape to it. That's what you think of. You can take a clone of that tree and put it in a different soil, it becomes round. So yes, gene expression, especially with a lot of genes, environment is a major player. And yes, genes interact with each other. Yes, there are going to be other epigenetic factors. Again, we could, if you want to take my genetics class, anyone out there, right, we can go through all these in a little more detail. Actually, we can't even go into all the detail in 16 weeks. This is, but it's really important to realize environment is a factor. And yes, we're going to have people who may have migrated to a different area and they still have those genes, but environment is not switching those genes on.
That was one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the content that you had us grapple with, the Howard Hughes Medical Institution video that was talking about environmental pressures on the evolution of skin color. So not all environmental influences eventually kind of become a part of our genome, but some of them are, and skin color is one of them. But there are other examples of environmentally mediated population differences that have evolved. So I'm thinking of our ability to digest lactose, for example. Not all of us have that. Not all of us have that particular ability that is a part of our genome, but some of us have evolved that ability. So why do you think skin color as an environmentally mediated evolved trait has become so important culturally? So if we have a hard time talking about its importance biologically, certainly it's become important socially or culturally. So what's the big deal about skin color? Why do you think we've kind of fixated on that to almost ignoring other traits like height, as you point out, as potentially important differences among populations?
Boy, that's a tough question to answer all of society's opinions on that. But I think one thing is, we recognize patterns, right? I mean, and we notice things that are different. And that, I mean, I think, again, I'm not a sociologist, so I can't answer, or an anthropologist, but I think, it's obvious when someone, if someone is 7 feet tall, you say we don't distinguish on height, but if someone is 7 feet tall, we do sort of notice that. And I think, for some reason, they're we've been around, we were isolated for a long time in pockets. I mean, we're a fairly new species, but when you're not around other groups that don't look like you, and then all of a sudden you are, you're going to notice differences, right? And that's just one of the things we do. I think it's human nature. The problem is when we start to put it into context where we start judging the character of people from a phenotypic difference. And again, I'm not totally sure I can answer that question. Bob, you want to throw your thoughts on that?
I think it's the visual. Humans just like to classify things to make it easy to, for social reasons or political reasons. They just like to categorize you based on your party affiliation or group. Grouping makes it easy. Now, visual grouping is common. Even scientists, botanical classifications is based on color, form, and so on. And it makes it, I think it simplifies our relationships with human groups. I think the problem arises when you see a certain regional trait express themselves within a group, we start to generalize those traits within a group. And that's, I think, a common misuse of, science, medicine, and so on. I mean, you might be 80% of the time right through some statistical correlations, but, without knowing the mechanisms of how those arose. That's what we should be focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're holding our genetic sequences, we can't read them, they're invisible to us. So I think it's a crutch that humans use to group people to simplify how they behave.
I think that's a great response, and I think it's a perfect time to actually ask a question from someone in attendance that connects to exactly what you're talking about. And this question is from Betty Lohr, and she says, one writer suggested that the term race be replaced with the word ancestry. What would be the significance of that change?
I guess, you want me to start here, but I'll think a little bit about this. I mean, I think race is a really broad category, right? I mean, if we went into ancestry, maybe if you talked about, more of your heritage, right, from a specific region, it would probably be more precise. And we could get into the sickle cell anemia analogy, where not everyone in Africa, right, has had the selection pressure of malaria. Okay, we go to the West Coast, we go up into a little part of the northern area near the Mediterranean. Yes, we have, individuals here are going to have this gene. Other areas, there is no selection pressure. We don't have this gene. Yet when we say race, we're sort of lumping those all into one category, right? And so from an application standpoint, yeah, you'd be a lot more specific in your terminology. It still opens up that human nature issue of, are we now going to start picking ethnic groups and decide, well, this one has this trait and this one has this trait? That's, again, we get back into the same problem with human nature, but, it's genetically, it's so broad when you're going across a continent, there's so much genetic variability. If we could get more into pockets or regions, there's going to be probably less genetic variability. And that, I think that is what the author is sort of referring to with ancestry, as opposed to race.
My opinion is that, going away from the term race, the category, to ethnicity or ancestry is a step in the right direction, but I think it's just a substitute of the same grouping. now that people are immigrating, you know, if you do the 23andMe, they say, oh, we're gonna, you know, tell you who your ancestors are. I mean, what importance is that? One, and with mixed marriages and this mixing of different ancestries, I think ultimately we're going to find out that we're all cousins. And, you know, why do we want to identify ourselves with, again, another group, you know, in Northern Europe or Africa or Asia and so on? You know, what benefit other than, I think, again, the urge that people have to belong to some group, and I think, or pride within your ancestors. And I don't know whether that's a healthy social, you know, activity.
So yeah, you know, and I guess that's human nature, as you mentioned, Bob, that we classify people in groups. I mean, that's what we do, and you know, it's funny because we sequence all the DNA, right? And I'll be honest, I did the 23andMe just to find out, and again, take 23andMe and Ancestry and these other sequencing services. They're sort of fun and amusing, but they're not real science, is the first thing I need to point out. I mean, sequencing your entire genome would give you a much better read for your genetic makeup. That would be an encyclopedia. That would cover my entire office, right? And then I'd have to read all of it and understand it. And I don't want to go there at this point. When you do a 23andMe, basically you're getting a magazine article from that encyclopedia, right? And then we make these inferences because it's sort of fun, right? You're like, oh my goodness, look where I'm from. I've got this and this. But you know, it makes me wonder a little bit in the future when if everyone sequences their DNA, are we going to start discriminating on your genes, right? Your genetic makeup, because that's human nature. That's the you know, I don't have a solution to that, but we do that.
And that's where I think the danger is. It's not, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with ancestor, finding out who your ancestors are, and pride. All those things are good, but misuse of that information through political thing. What if we had another eugenics surge? Insurance companies, what are they going to do with that information? You know, I think we really need to realize how this kind of scientific information is going to be used by people with power or influence. You know, a lot of times science will progress without considering, you know, moral and social implications of the information that we're, you know, being able to distribute more and more cheaply. Now, there are medical reasons for knowing, I think, some of the ancestries, which they're mapped based on the HLA type, or the major histocompatibility complex is used by 23andMe to determine your heritage. Now, that is important if you're looking for a organ transplant, for instance. Those kinds of genetic tests can have positive implications, but just for the mere, you know, generating all this data without control. I mean, we're concerned about private medical information. I think we should also, you know, be wary of how this information can be used if it's in the public domain.
Yeah, we're actually gonna move the conversation to talk a little bit more about medicine in just a bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about a question that we have in the audience, and also something that was in one of the readings. While we say that, you know, race is not biological, one of the readings you posted, Scott, said something about that we are affected biologically by race because of racism. And that although race itself is not biological, there are a lot of biological effects that we experience because of the race, the social construction of race and racism in society. That connects a lot to a question from Nora from the Q&A, and she says, how can trauma affect one's genetic makeup, especially in regards to people of color living through systemic oppression and violence? And so I just wonder, what do you think about the genetic trauma affecting the genetic, or is it more that the trauma comes as a result of the racism and affects our biology?
Bob, you want to start there? I mean, obviously, you know, any stress, any impact on your DNA. We talked about environmental components, right? We have epigenetic components. So I have to think that trauma is going to change gene expression. If we put stress on you know, our genes, can we pass some of this epigenetic markers on? Yes, we can. So, you know, obviously there is some detrimental impact to, you know, systemic racism and trauma from that standpoint. Bob, do you?
Yeah, I agree that there's mounting evidence that stress and trauma can induce methylation of DNA, which is one of the mechanisms of this epigenetic influence of environment to gene expression. But we really don't understand, the targets of the genes. I mean, is methylation targeting certain kinds of genes? If we knew, if there was a specific target that stress influences, I think we would be, I mean, that would be a great scientific study, but we really don't know the consequences, genetic consequences of which genes are influenced by stress.
There's a lot of potential for research in the future.
One, I think one that is known is that stress increases susceptibility and by depressing your immune functions. So at least in my field, I know that stress-induced health can, make you susceptible to infections and so on.
I think that's a really important finding, as it just connects to critical race theory and just the current debate on, is critical race theory real? And we know that critical race theory is just the study pretty much of systemic racism, and recognizing that race and racism are kind of endemic to the fabric of our society. We learned in our last week's lesson that race is this social construction. It's been socially constructed. And even in some of the readings this week, that point is emphasized. But if we are to deny that there is systemic racism, then it is to then deny the effect that trauma from racism can have on particular groups and people of color specifically. I think that this is just a great way to show the relevance of just the crux of critical race theory. It is the systemic issues. It's not, I like the way Veronica put it last week. It's a space, it's an environment. It's not just individual people, but it's operating an environment that is based on a racist construct that can cause trauma, that can then impact people biologically, and that does impact people biologically. Let's see, we got some other great questions here in our Q&A. And here's one that's kind of interesting, and I think it connects to our current discussion. Are there biological markers that lend themselves to a more or less judgmental brain? And this is Pastor Paul, and he says that his intuition thinks that it's solely cultural, nothing biological, that makes us judgmental.
I saw that question, and I think it links back to, he asked it when we were talking about pattern seeking and why skin color is such a big deal. So like, what is it that's kind of grabbing us? As a psychologist, I like it. I think we're going to come back to it whenever we get to race in the brain, but what do y'all think? Are there biological markers that jump out at us a bit more, and is it cultural?
I can't answer that. This sounds like a psychology question, Dr. Newton. This may be more up your pathway. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously environment impacts us in a lot of ways, but there are patterns that our brain is set to identify. I mean, there may be certain instincts. I don't know that. I mean, that sounds like something that a field that you could study more. Bob, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I'm always wary of looking for single biomarkers for any biological trait, with the exceptions of these rare genetic diseases that you mentioned. Most behavior or even schizophrenia is a polygenic, multi-gene environmental interactions that manifest these behaviors. So I don't think it's like the Holy Grail. I don't think you'll find a single biomarker that is linked to those kinds of traits.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There was another question that built off of what y'all were talking about for epigenetics and the myelination of genes. So Hazard McGregor asked, is it possible or one day possible to quantify generational stress based on genes? For example, person 1 has a level 5 and person 2 has a level 10. Like, will we be able to objectively quantify the impact of stress one day?
Well,
there's a lot of variables. You're talking to scientists here, right? We like to we like to be a little more specific. That seems that would be one heck of an experiment.
yeah, but still, again, we're into this, quantitation is a scientific tool, but when it's misused, you end up with things like IQ test scores, SAT scores. Everyone is going to respond to stress in different ways. So it's a personalized. The number, if it's ranked by an individual based on their baseline, ranking, and they see an increase or decrease in this scoring system, maybe it would have some use. But to come up with some kind of standardized scoring system for those things, I think we're going down the wrong path.
That would be one heck of experimental design there. The complexity seems unrealistic.
If we had inbred, if we were doing this study in inbred Bauchi mice, maybe those numbers would have some relevance. But
exactly.
Not human population, I don't think it would work.
The environmental variables we've talked about and all the gene combinations, it would be, what you're talking about is on an exponential scale. It would be incredible. Let's just leave it at that.
We're trying to standardize something that is so diverse, i.e. the human population. That's very difficult, if impossible.
I have something that I think takes us in a slightly different direction. In the Jablonski article that you posted, Scott, the author chooses the word overlooked to describe why skin has not been researched more. The article that you posted just about skin. But the reasons that the author gives as to why skin is not researched, it seems to suggest an avoidance more than an overlooking. And I just wonder, what would be your assessment of why more biologists are not choosing to pursue this line of research? And how important do you think this research is to conversations on racial healing?
That is, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'm thinking a little bit about, again, we're going right back to talking about why haven't people been interested in the genetic mechanisms? You're right. Why hasn't this research been at the forefront? And I don't, maybe in the past, again, our mindset has changed a lot, as a society. And honestly, I think if we went back, genetics is a fairly, you can say, oh, Mendel, right? It's been around a long time, but modern molecular genetics is a fairly new science. And the first things that really came out of this science were single gene, discrete, easy to explain, easy to identify if we go into the 1950s and 1960s. And so when we start talking about things like skin color, it's a very complex issue. And I don't think we had the tools, quite frankly, the computing power, the sequencing power that we have today. And throw in that the cultural dynamics have changed in this country. And so, I think that probably nowadays people want to fund this type of research. It doesn't bring up the taboos and also the science of looking at multiple genes and this type of inheritance is now becoming standard. We have the tools to look at it. So I think those are some of the reasons that we didn't look at it sooner. I mean, looking at Jablonski's, research, and I hope a lot of you have watched the Howard Hughes video. I hope you'll all watch the video. You realize that NASA had all this data on UV radiation, right, throughout the planet. And then imagine going to each person and asking, we want to find out what the color of your skin is. I got to think this may have been an uncomfortable question to ask 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We're going to take a refractometer and take a sample from under your arm somewhere. So, and I think some of that maybe still gets people nervous. I mean, there's still issues there. So, I mean, that obviously it's not clear cut, but getting back to just putting that kind of research project together, appreciating overlaying the maps of radiation, skin pigmentation, shades, right, altitudes, and then looking at other factors involved, as Bob has pointed out. I mean, different diets, right? We have people who all of a sudden, well, they're not getting as much UV radiation. Why do they have dark skin? Oh, they have a different diet. This is not it's not an easy study to put together. This is expensive. This is complex. It's going to take really unique minds. And so all those things, and the technology now is better for this. We are now more aware of this. So I think all of that coming together makes this less overlooked than it used to be in the past.
Can I also ask Dr. Schaefer and Dr. Esch, do you think it's also because scientists have kind of stepped in it in the past too? So like social Darwinism, eugenics, there's some really ugly history in science grappling with the idea of race. Is a hesitation to repeat past mistakes maybe part of this avoidance of the study of the topic?
I don't think that's coming from the scientists. Well, I mean, I think the scientists are going to trudge ahead regardless, based on their interest. I think, going back to Summer's question, I would hypothesize that the reason is how science is funded. So if you look at the NIH, the groups that fund are mostly white males. Okay, so their interests influence, the governments influence how scientific research is done. And so in this case, the more scientists of color that ask these questions, and the more NIH funding agencies start to show interest in it, I think we're going to see it, just like what we saw with the Howard Hughes Institute. If you go to other countries outside of the US, you will see specific, like medical research. Medical research conducted only in, say, racial clinical trials. A lot of countries now are requiring representation by multiple ethnic groups in order to license efficacy and safety trials. I think we're becoming more and more aware of these, and I think more interest is being shown, and I think we're going to see more and more of those kinds of studies being funded. I think it's the funding, it's expensive, as Scott said, and you have to rely on, these studies can't be independently funded. You have to rely on government, people who approve these programs. That's where it starts.
Reminds me of the BiDill paper that Scott had us read. Can you connect those for us, Scott?
Boy, so the BiDill is one of those real, and Bob, I'm going to count on your medical expertise a little bit because I'm a plant guy here, but the BiDill drug is one of those things when you look at the studies that were set up, and I think that you probably have a lot of questions in the chat, coming up with BiDill, but here was a medicine, here was a medication for treating heart failure, and it was basically a combination of two other medications. right, in combination. And, you know, there was some, you know, there was a study that showed that survival in African-American populations was higher. Now, some of that makes me, there's some questionable things there, right? I mean, at first there wasn't, then they re-looked at it and there was, and, you know, you start to wonder about a lot of things here as we go through this paper. But what is fascinating is here is a drug being marketed to a race. And I mean, again, I don't think we can have a one size fits all for anything to say that this is going to work good for this race. I mean, and you know, as you go through the paper, you talk about, well, self-identifying. So you're one, you know, you're 1/16th, right? You have one great-great-grandfather who was African-American. You're going to have it's going to have the same efficiency. I mean, honestly, I don't think it probably is going to have the same efficiency, because skin color is not really going to determine the impact, right? Whatever your skin pigmentation is, I would think it's going to work the same. So this seems more like a marketing gimmick to me. And, you know, what was interesting is realizing, I Googled BiDill just to take a look at their homepage, and maybe I can quickly share this with you. I hope I still have this up on my screen here, since you brought that up here. And again, I'm not sure how new this is, but this is BiDill.com talking about how it affects heart failure, you know. And again, you know, if you're African-American, you're more like other people in other ethnic groups, which is interesting, African-American ethnic group now. So I'm not sure how the classification works there, but what you can see here is like is specifically targeted for self-identified African-American patients. You know, I'm not sure how to interpret that, Bob. From a medical standpoint, I mean, there's so many interesting things, but this seems more like a marketing gimmick to me than actual science. But this was approved by the FDA.
Well, again, I mean, there's some marketing is, you know, when you look at most drug companies, I mean, they have to market them to specific groups again. So through correlation, they might have thought, well, you know, if we can hit 80% of the people who would need it, we're going to market to a certain ethnic group because heart disease may be more common. Now, from an economic point of view, maybe that's all they want to do. But when you really look at it from a public health point of view, are you going to exclude the 20 or 30% of the non-Black population from benefiting from this drug? You know, so it just goes back to the statistical misuse of you know, the underlying cause of these diseases, and with the use of, you know, genetic sequencing now, you know, response to drugs, you know, through genome-wide association studies, we're going to be able to target drug use much more efficiently than using this crutch through correlation analysis with a disease with a certain group and using marketing to reach them. So I have hopes in this DNA revolution to go away. We're going to start going away from race as a group to offer, you know, treatments to and health. It would be more individualized, more precise. You know, this whole thing of personalized medicine through DNA sequencing, I think, is really where the future lies.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I wanted to agree with Bob there, and I was going to go down that same avenue, that personalized medicine, I think, is going to have, you know, the growth in that area over the next 10, 20 years is going to be incredible. Sequencing, you know, DNA and individually targeting drugs to a DNA sequence is so much better than a blanket one size, everyone from this continent, this drug is going to work. Whereas we can target to specific individuals that have that protein, that have that biological pathway.
Regardless of,
I was just, let me jump in here, guys. The whole idea of self-identifying as race, I think that it just brings up that's problematic in terms of how the drug is being marketed. Because, you know, you can walk in there, Scott, and say, well, I'm African-American, I've self-identified as African-American,
Right.
and the drug, if we're basing it on self-identification. But I think that just takes us back to the whole idea that race is this social construction. And so, you know, one can identify, can assert whatever identity he or she wants to assert. And so if we can't connect it to something biological, then I think that we have a big problem with saying this is right for this race or this is right for, you know, for that race. So I think that that is very problematic. And that kind of connects to a question that Betty had asked earlier about the term self-identified race and how it differs from race. And I think, Betty, I've kind of answered that for you, but you guys are welcome to chime in. But that, you know, we can decide to identify the way we want to identify. So you may look at me and say, oh, you're a Black woman, you're an African-American woman. And I can say, yes, I am, or I can say, no, I'm not. I'm Ghanaian. I'm, you know, I could be from anywhere, and I can identify as whatever I choose to identify. We've been socialized to fit into the identities that the US government says you're either Black, you're either white, you're either non-Hispanic, you're, you know, or Hispanic. And so those categories, as you all have said, are problematic because they just don't accurately describe who we may believe we are. So.
Yeah, I think with Dr. Mccomb, I think in last week, you know, I think it starts when you're young. When the school teacher that said, okay, how many are you Hispanic or Jamaican or whatever? And the teacher tells her, no, you're Black, you know, it's what other people tell us who we are that influences us more than, you know, who we think we are. I mean, I really identified with Dr. Mccomb there because my mother is Japanese, my father is European. I grew up in Japan. All my Japanese cousins, you know, called me a strange foreigner or a strange white person. And then I come to the States, you know, and are you Polynesian? You know, I think we just have to deal with what other people think of us and try to overcome, you know, how it influences our identity. And that's a struggle, you know, for, I think, most populations, depending on where, you know, where they live.
Yeah, I think the biological viewpoint, though, is helpful in helping us unlearn some of what we've been taught to always point to race as this biological construct. And I think about the American Association of Biological Anthropologists statement on race, where, and I'm just going to brief quote from there, it says that the Western concept of race must be understood as a classification system that emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and discrimination. It thus does not have its roots in biological reality, but in policies of discrimination. And that's from the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. And so we know that that thinking of it as a social construct does not really reflect the mainstream thinking about race. People still immediately think of biology first when thinking about race, and then maybe some social stereotypes. So I guess I'm just thinking as we look, you know, as we think about biology and race, and as our last speaker, Dr. Mccomb, kind of challenged us to begin the unlearning process of race and unlearning what we've been socialized to believe about race. What are your thoughts on how we, non-biologists, and also you all as biologists and scientists, can just begin to unlearn race as a biological construct? And then how can we socialize and teach our children differently?
Well, that's a great point. First of all, yeah, race has no place in biological classification. It really doesn't work. And, you know, the more we know, and I think, you know, you say, how do we have this discussion? Well, I think we have to become scientifically literate. I mean, and I think, you know, the average citizen also needs to say, okay, I need to take a biology class. I need to start to understand. And I know it's not all fun. You were listening to me going through A's and T's and G's, but you know, I think we have to start to understand the biological system as a whole, and we have to understand genetics as a whole. And when we see that, we're going to see that, you know, it totally eradicates this you know, biological, this social construct when we put it in biological terms. And, you know, as the Howard Hughes video was saying, we all have white bones, we all have red blood, right? Our biochemistry is the same. You know, our DNA molecules are all going to look the same under a microscope. And I think we just have to unlearn some things. And what we really have to do is become scientifically literate, I think is step one. And then we have to have the conversations, and we have to, you know, and that's not always comfortable. We have to have the conversations with some literacy and knowledge when we have them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we take it for granted as scientists, race is, you know, really never entered into biology. But, you know, why does the public, you know, still have difficulty separating race as a, or, you know, admitting that it's a social construct and not a biological one? I think the responsibility really falls on scientists to be able to communicate this. I mean, you know, we have difficulty communicating science in terms that non-scientists can understand. So if it's so obvious to us, we should learn how to communicate, teach our children, teach science in a more broad sense rather than memorization. I mean, you know, I have opinions about how science is taught in our educational system, but, you know, still, I think scientists should bear some responsibility in teaching this at all age groups. Earlier, the better. Yeah.
And it comes back to, I think education is so important. And I think we need to put a stronger emphasis on education at every level, and it's science at every level. And yeah, we do have to do a better job. I agree. We are horrible communicators because
it's so esoteric. You know, we need to be able to translate scientific principles in an understandable.
But it also goes down to, when you look at mainstream America, right? We'll say, okay, 97% of scientists agree with something. And then all of a sudden we'll see the 2% gets as much attention as the 97%, right? Someone's like, well, there's one scientist out there who disagreed, and this sounds like the view that you want to see as your worldview. And all of a sudden that's getting as much attention in certain outlets. And you know,
fake science and people who misuse what our intent was and twisting it in such a way for political gain or, you know, social gain. We need to speak out against how our knowledge and information is being misused. I think that's just as important.
It's good to know that we have scientists like y'all on the front lines of that endeavor. And before Summer closes us out this evening, I also wanted to observe that it might be easy to walk away from this evening thinking that race is not an important construct. And that's not, I think, what y'all are saying. You're saying that race is biologically meaningless, but it doesn't mean that it's sociologically or culturally meaningless. And I think we're going to continue to dig into that in future weeks, the role that race can perhaps play a positive role in our society under some circumstances in which it can provide a sense of identity or belonging if we can kind of strip away the harmful effects to the extent that that's possible in our historical context. So not that race is unimportant. It's biologically meaningless, but it is not so socially meaningless.
Thank you. That's
yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for discussing these important issues with us. I think we have some very good nuggets and takeaways, and we have several other materials on the Canvas site that we can peruse to learn more about this issue. And so I would just like to thank you all again for your time, and we look forward to tuning in next week.
with Dr. Shamika Stokes, right? Dr. Carol, she'll be speaking with us about institutionalized and systemic racism. So we're going to come from a biological perspective all the way back to a social one.
Yes.
See y'all next week.
All right.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Summer. Thank you, Taylor.
Sure. Thank you all.